In the next episode, some content will be translated or subtitled from Korean to English. For the best experience, we recommend you watching the video or reading the subtitles. Thank you. Hello everyone and welcome to Echoes of Seoul. We are here once again to talk about different cultural aspects from Korea, and I am Benjamin and I'm joined by my amazing co-host Liz.
Hello everyone, I'm Liz, as Benjamin said, and today on our podcast we're going to talk a little bit about overseas Korean, especially about kyopos.
Yeah, Kyopo. And it's something that is actually related to you. So, can you explain why or introduce yourself a little bit?
Of course. So, I was born in the United States, but I was raised in Mexico for all my life. Both my parents are Koreans, and I now live in Korea as part of my education system.
Yes, so far. Well, thank you so much once again for joining us today. And as you previously mentioned, we're gonna talk about overseas Koreans. Can you tell me a little bit more what is that concept? I know that in Korean it's called gyopo. So can you tell me a little bit more of what do you think it is?
Yes, so overseas Korean is someone whose whole family lineage is Korean or has some parts of a Korean blood, but they were raised in another country. So in other terms, they would be like Korean American or Korean Mexican. And I think that overseas Koreans in general, they're a part of Koreans, but they're also a little bit different.
Yeah.
That's what I kind of feel.
It's kind of tricky. It's like a really special concept
Yeah.
because everyone has different meanings for the same word. And that's why we went out to the streets to ask some Koreans what do they think about this concept and what is the idea they have about Kyopo. So let's go to check what do they say. 교포에 대해 무엇을 알고 계신가요?
교포는 한국이 아니라 다른 국가에 완전히 이주해서 살고 있는 사람들이라고 알고 있습니다.
일단은 재외 국민이거나 국적을 변경했지만 여전히 대한민국에 핏줄을 타고나 있는 사람으로 알고 있습니다.
교포는 뭐 외국에 나간 한국 사람인데 이제 국적은 없는, 한국 국적은 없는 그렇게 알고 있습니다.
다음 교포에 대해 어떻게 생각하시나요?
한국이 아니라 해외에서 살고 다른 나라에서 삶을 개척하는 것이 쉽지 않다는 것을 알고 있기 때문에 되게 열심히 살고 어떻게 보면 대단하다고 평가할 수 있는 사람들이라고 생각합니다.
사실 누가 이렇게 질문하지 않으면 크게 생각하지 않고 넘어갈 정도의 분들이라고 저는 보고요. 그리고 굳이 교포에 대해서 어떻게 생각하느냐를 제가 생각해야 한다면 저는 좋은 이미지를 가지고 있습니다.
뭐 다양하게 있는데 그냥 외국인이지만 이제 한국과 가까운 점이 있는 외국인이라고 생각하는 경우도 있고, 네, 뭐 그런 경우 많습니다. 그런 경우가.
그 중에 교포들은 진짜 한국인이라고 생각해요?
한국 국적이 아니라 다른 국적을 가졌더라도 한국에만 있는 집단적 정서를 이해할 수 있는 그리고 집단적 의식을 받아들이고 이용할 수 있는 사람들이기 때문에 교포 역시 한국인이라고 생각합니다.
법에서 재외동포를 한국인이라고 규정하니까 따로 우리가 의문을 가질 필요는 없다고 생각합니다.
사실 제가 생각하기에 이제 뭐 한국인이냐 아니냐는 그 교포들이 어떻게 생각하느냐에 따른다고 생각을 하거든요. 만약에 한국계 미국인이면 이제 뭐 자기는 미국인이다 하면 미국인인 거고, 아니다 나는 한국 사람이다 하면은 한국 사람인 거고, 뭐 그거에 대해서 뭐 저희가 이제 한국인이 이렇게 정할 그런 필요도 그럴 뭐 자격도 없다고 생각을 합니다.
그리고 생각하는 진짜 한국인의 정의의 무엇인가요?
방금 말했듯이 그런 한국 사회에서 나고 자라거나 그러지 않더라도 한국의 역사와 어떤 인간상을 기반으로 집단적 의식과 집단 정서를 공감하고 그게 무의식에 내재되어 있는 사람들이 한국인들이라고 생각합니다.
일단 한국어를 하고 한국의 이런 문화들 있잖아요. 그에 익숙하고 그리고 뭐 자기가 한국 사람이라고 생각하면 이 세 가지 요소가 갖춰졌다고 생각을 하면은 저는 한국인이라고 생각합니다. 국적, 여하 없이.
있을 때
한국 사람들이 교포라는 게 그냥 미국이나 아니면 유럽에서 살고 있는 한국인들이라고 생각하는데 혹시 동의하시나요?
반드시 그렇게 한정 지을 필요는 없을 것 같고 요즘 저도 지금 대학에서 문학이랑 미디어를 공부하고 있거든요. 그렇게 보면은 생각보다 다양한 나라에서 사람들이 많이 와요. 그럼 그중에서 교포로 당연히 있고 그들을 만나면서 저도 기존에 가지고 있던 주로 미국에 있을 것이다 하는 편견은 많이 깨졌습니다.
한국어 못하는 교포들이 몇 번 있는데 그거에 대해 어떻게 생각해요?
그런 교포 1세가 아니라 2세대, 3세대 이렇게 점점 내려가면 한국에서 진짜 나고 자란 게 아니라 추가적으로 공부해야 되는 사람들인 거잖아요. 자신의 조상들을 바탕으로. 한국과 점점 멀어지고 있지만 그럼에도 한국의 어떤 역사나 사회를 공부한다면 한국인으로도 정체성을 확립할 수 있지 않을까 생각합니다.
전혀 문제가 안 된다고 생각합니다. 한국어를 못하는 교포라는 그런 프레임 자체가 저는 잘 이해가 안 되고요. 우리나라 국적을 가지고 있지만 외국에 태어나서 그 외국의 언어를 마루텅으로 지니고 있는 것이 왜 잘못된 건지 문제가 돼야 되는지 모르겠습니다. 그들이 반드시 한국어를 잘하지 못한다고 해서 그들이 우리나라에 기여하지 않는다라는 것은 발상이 좀 촌스러운 것 같습니다.
저는 사실 언어를 소통할 줄만 아면 된다고 생각해가지고 만약에 소통을 할 수 없을 정도로 하면은 뭐 약간 제가 생각하는 한국인의 기준에서 좀 멀어지는 거죠.
교포들을 만나본 적이 있나요?
아니요, 없습니다.
없습니다.
저는 직접적으로 주변에 교포를 만난 적은 없는데 혼혈 출신의 사람들은 꽤 만났어요. 국적은 대한민국인데 부모님 중에서 한 분이 외국분이신 분들은 친구로 꽤 두고 있거든요. 그분들이 때로는 저보다 더한 애국심을 가지고 있는 걸 보고 저는 놀랄 때가 많습니다.
사실 교포랑은 만나보긴 했습니다. 근데 이제 평생을 뭐 미국에서 산 사람 이런 사람은 만나보진 않았고 이제 뭐 5년 정도 살아온 사람, 7년 정도 살아온 사람 이런 사람들을 이제 고등학교에서 친구로 만난 적은 있습니다.
So after those great interviews, actually I want to ask you, Liz, what is your take on what 교포 means for Koreans? Have you ever experienced like any kind of preference like from Koreans or like any kind of stereotype from them?
I feel like a foreigner to them, even though I'm technically a Korean. By passport, by nationality, I am technically a Korean. But when I meet other Koreans, I feel like they kind of see me as a foreigner or that I don't really belong in some sort of way. And I feel that is mostly because like my cultural thinking, the way that I think, the way that I act, and my accent, for example, are very different from normal Koreans, real Koreans. I feel 100% pure Koreans. And I feel like that kind of makes me feel like I don't really belong anywhere because, well, for example, in Mexico, because of how I look, a foreigner, right? I'm a Korean. Other people will look at me and they wouldn't think, oh, she's a Mexican. They would think, oh, she's a Korean. She's Asian. But when I come here, I might look the part, but I certainly don't feel Korean. And so I feel like there's a lot of stereotypes in a way. Some negative, obviously, but there are also some positive ones. I feel like as I talk to many Koreans, I feel like I heard that they're jealous that I can speak English well, or that I can speak other languages as good, or that I had the opportunity to live in a foreign country before coming to Korea. And sometimes, like, I understand their perspective, and I think I would also think the same way if I was a full Korean. But I think we should also take in consideration that yes, it's nice to know other languages and it's nice to have the experience, but when you're living in Korea and you're supposed to adapt to the culture in order to keep on living, it's kind of hard to be jealous of that, to kind of like feel, oh, she's privileged because of that. That's what I kind of feel.
Yeah, like one of the interviews said that he knows that Koreans, overseas Korean, are considered by law Koreans.
Exactly.
In your case, you have two nationalities,
Yes.
which means you have two passports. But for some Koreans, it's like if they don't even know the language, how can they consider themselves Korean enough, right? As a foreigner living in Korea, I kind of feel that we have some points in common because you feel like this is not your home.
Yeah.
But in my case, when I go back to my country, I feel also the same because I've been outside my home country for a long time. Everything, of course, changed there. I change, I adapt to the new country I move. So you start feeling like you don't have like a real home at one point.
Yeah.
For me, like I feel like it started to happen after 2 years living here in Korea because here I don't use Spanish that much. I usually use more Korean than English. And it feels weird go back to your language every time you need to. And if you grow up in another country that doesn't even share the same language you learn with your parents, it's gonna be really confusing. Like, how about your childhood? Like, how are you born in the US?
Yes.
When did you move to Mexico?
I think when I was really, really young, like I barely remember anything at all. I think what actually happened was that I was my mom was on a trip to the United States, and I just decided that I was ready to go into the world. So I was a little bit earlier than anticipated. And I feel like that's how I got my passport.
So you were actually supposed to be born in Mexico,
Yes,
but because of the trip, you were born in the US. Okay, that's kind of funny.
It is.
Yeah, but let's go back to childhood in Mexico. As someone who is from Latin America, we have some things in common with Mexico. In my country, there is the concept that is called Chino, that everyone that came from Asia, they are considered Chinos,
Yes.
which is the Spanish word for Chinese. But have you ever heard that kind of comments?
Yes, of course I have.
And how do you feel about them?
So, of course, there's a lot of stereotypes that if you're Asian, then you're Chinese. So, for example, when I would go to parks, like theme parks, a lot of people would look at me in either awe or in admiration that I was Korean, or some would look at me in a more racist way. So you could kind of see like that sometimes being Korean came with exotism, where a lot of people would admire Korean culture and be really, really jealous of it. And for example, I would just be walking around and people would come up to me and ask if they could take a picture with me. They would be like, "Hey, are you Korean?" I'm like, "Yeah, I'm Korean." Then they're like, "Can I take a picture?" And it's like, it happens a lot of times to the point that it's normal.
And they will be like, "Oh, you speak Spanish."
Yeah.
Like, well.
Yeah, but since it happens so much, I try to act like I don't speak Spanish in order to kind of be like, "Oh, sorry, I don't speak Spanish." So
No. Oh yeah, I like in Korea I sometimes do that. Like I don't speak Korean in order like to ignore or try to avoid some
Do a lot of
situations.
people
Yes.
try to take pictures?
Not try to take pictures, but they try like, oh, I really want to make friends with foreigners, which is really common. I really want to exchange language exchange.
Yes, language exchange.
So it's like, I don't speak Korean. And oh, if they say I speak English, I also don't speak English. Like,
Oh, you only speak Spanish.
Yeah, just Spanish. And then yeah, it actually happened to me. This is so random, but when I was living in Busan, because I used to live in Busan. You know, all those church, like thing they have like activities where they gather some foreigners
Oh,
and
yeah.
they sometimes they are scams as well.
No, of
And
course.
they start speaking to me in English. Then I say no. And then they start speaking in Korean. But then I say no Korean. And then they start speaking in Portuguese. All of a
What?
sudden, it was like wow. I mean, I can understand Portuguese, but it was so weird.
Yeah,
Like they're
imagine.
ready for everything. Like they're ready.
Everything except Spanish, apparently.
Exactly. So when we're talking about representation and stereotype, we should go back a little bit to some academic research with it because we're gonna like trying to incorporate that so people listening to us can also have some reference from different authors. And what is the first one we have here?
Yeah, so for the first one, we have In the Spectacle of the Other by Stuart Hall. He explains about how stereotypes typically reinforce power dynamics and how they mark people as different. So it would be a case of us versus them, or you versus us kind of thing. And so it talks about stereotypes and about exotism, as I said a little bit before.
Yeah.
It comes about, is a culture more like authentic or is it more of a trend? And he also kind of talks about, the author kind of talks about privilege and to being like disconnected to your true culture because of all these stereotypes that one might kind of portray into you. So what do you kind of think?
I totally agree with that point. But when you talk about privileges and feeling disconnected from your real culture, which is Korean, have you ever experienced that by living here in Korea where you say like, oh my god, I don't connect with this?
Yeah. So I lived in Korea now for 2 years.
Yes.
And there have been a lot of times where I have felt pure regret of coming here. Because I feel so disconnected, or I feel like I don't really belong here. It makes me feel a case of like pure Koreans versus us. And it sometimes I feel like I search more foreign people than Korean people because they kind of have at least a common ground with me of, oh, we're not Koreans. We're not the same as Korean people, so we don't kind of belong here, even if we try to. But I don't truly also belong in the foreigner group because I don't look foreigner. I'm Korean technically, so I should feel like I belong here. And I have some overseas Koreans that have also told me the same thing, where they don't really feel like they belong here, and they're kind of looking to go away after they finish college or something. But I feel like this is not always the case because, for example, some other friends who have lived with me, same conditions in Mexico, have actually adapted to Korean culture incredibly well to the point that I feel like they're just Koreans. So
I mean, you are.
I mean, yeah, I'm also Korean, but it's interesting how some people adapt really fast to the culture, while some take a lot of time to be able to truly connect with the place that they're living in.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting how, even for you, sometimes it's really hard to consider yourself as like truly Korean, because what is the concept of being truly Korean? Like someone that speaks really well Korean, someone that can eat Korean food. Yeah, just living in another country is a whole challenge. But for your case, you have like a combination of different backgrounds that are always trying to fight in your side, maybe, that what is the one that match myself, right?
Yeah.
And you mentioned like we have like a common ground. I'm also a foreigner living in Korea. Foreigner, I think it's not just for Korean case. There's other foreigners living all over the world.
Exactly.
And like you mentioned, you have some friends that adapt really
Yes.
well to the Korean culture. And I'm really curious about those friends. How do you met them? Like, how do you get close with them? There are communities outside about like overseas Koreans, or there's like online communities. What is the way you guys gather?
Yes, so actually in our school there's a club for overseas Koreans.
Really?
Yeah, and I met some of my friends there. They're from a lot of different countries. There were some from Russia, from Germany, from Mexico, and I feel like, but some of them, when I met them the first time, some of them felt as if they were 100% true Koreans. And when I asked them, they said that they used to hang out a lot with Korean people in their home country, or that they would speak a lot of Korean in their like home. And for example, I wasn't able to really experience that until like my last years of high school, which I feel like maybe that's the reason why I feel kind of distant from Korean culture in general, and I feel more close to like Mexican culture. It could be. But that's kind of what I think.
Yeah, it's really interesting, I think. Let's go back to something you mentioned really before about racism. Racism, privilege, and systematic biases. You have experienced racism in Korea and Mexico, but I think we already talked a lot about Mexico, the Mexican case. But how about living in Korea? Have you ever experienced that kind of situations where people refer to you in a really bad way, or they're just trying to ask if you're actually really Korean or not?
Yes, I feel like there's a lot of interest in it. And it depends on how this interest comes up, because sometimes it can come out as ignorant. But most of the times, I feel like people don't really think of me as a foreigner as long as I don't speak. The moment that I speak, I feel like people, that's when they kind of notice, oh, she's a foreigner, because apparently I have like an accent.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's a little bit when people are like, oh, are you like a foreigner? And I'm like, yeah, I guess technically.
Yes.
If you ask me that way, then yeah. And they're like, oh, where are you from? And I'm like, I'm from Mexico. And it doesn't really feel like they're looking at me as if I'm inferior, but they have a lot of interest towards it. And sometimes I feel like the only times where I kind of feel like inferior is when in situations, there are like certain situations where I feel like I should know Korean, but I don't, and it feels a little bit degrading as a Korean person, because it's like, oh, you should know this, like, why don't you know this? You know, like, you're Korean. It's like, am I like, if you put it that way, then am I really a Korean person? Like, it doesn't feel like it.
Yeah, like in Korea, like there's systematic biases come into play really often. While Kyopo can have a lot of benefits, like you have a really foreigner education, you're bilingual, trilingual, but they're also considered as outsiders, same as with foreigners.
Yes.
So it is a complex mix of advantages and disadvantages. In this case, you just mentioned a lot of like disadvantages, because you're actually questioning yourself, like, am I enough Korean in different situations? So this brings us to the globalized 보사, origin of the idea of race. In that reading, we have the race as social construct plays a huge role in shaping overseas Korean, and they are treated both in Korean and abroad. For example, in Mexico, you sometimes treat them differently because of your appearance, right? Have you ever felt exotic because living in there?
Yes.
Like, but in a good and a bad way?
Both.
Oh.
So, like I said before, some people, I feel like a little bit of sometimes people would look at me as if I'm pretty, because I'm Korean, and I feel like that comes a little bit into bias. But I also feel like sometimes, for example, whenever I would go to places like Cancun, to like a beach place, and I would go to the hotels, when they first see me, they would talk in English, right? And I don't really mind, but their English is a little bit broken, so it's hard to understand sometimes. But so I respond in Spanish. So you would assume that since I respond in Spanish,
They will answer.
I will know in Spanish,
Yeah.
right? But they continue speaking to me in the broken English. And I can tell that there's something struggling with it. So I don't understand why they would continue speaking in English when it's so clearly that
You're
it would
able
be
to
that
communicate.
I'm okay with communicating in Spanish. And I feel like that sometimes makes me feel seen as an outsider. So but otherwise, like, some advantages, I feel like definitely foreign education, or by being able to be bilingual since a very young age. I feel like those are some advantages that people would say. And a lot of like interest into your culture, like, oh my god, you're Korean, what do you eat, what do you know about K-pop, what do you know about this latest drama that I seen. It's like, it's nice sometimes to feel appreciated in like a general interest, but it's not really into depth. It's
Yeah.
just like the basic,
yeah.
the surface level.
Maybe it's not actually into you as a person,
Yeah.
it's you as a Korean.
It sometimes
And
that's possible.
well, that's, we know it's thanks to the Hallyu, like the Korean
Hallyu
wave.
Yes.
But maybe this situation was not the same 20 years ago when there was no K-pop.
Yeah.
Maybe the disadvantages were much bigger than the advantages. Nowadays we can say that thanks to K-pop, there's a lot of people that have interest in Korea and they want to learn more.
Yeah, I feel actually, as someone who was living in Mexico before the whole Hallyu wave, I do feel that K-pop, K-drama, and all of this really had a big impact on how people saw us. Because before, I feel like people would see us and be like, oh, chinito,
Yeah.
Chinese, go back to your country.
Yes.
I actually have heard that before. They were like, oh, go back to your country, Chinese. I was like, what was that for? Like, what did I do to you? But as the Hallyu wave started, there have been less people who have said bad things to me directly, and instead have asked for a photo or have asked information about, like, BTS, for example. So it's like interest, but it lacks depth.
Yeah. Let's go to our last section for today's podcast, where we're going to talk a little bit about Korean migration, community as well, multiculturalism. And, well, we know that Korean migration started a long time ago.
Yes.
There is a lot of countries who have a lot of influence from Korea, a lot of people who migrated to countries like Uzbekistan, the US, and also Mexico, which have a really long story of Korean migration that started back in the 1905, when the first wave of Koreans arrived in the region of Yucatan, if I'm not wrong. That's a region in Mexico. So what do you know about Koreans in Mexico? Do you know a lot of them? Is there a community or something similar?
I feel like there's definitely a lot of Koreans in Mexico, more than you would think, I feel like. But it's also like we're still a minority in the country, so we're still a small community. But in a way, you can see how Koreans in Mexico are connected to each other, because every Korean, in a sense, knows another Korean who knows another Korean. So in a way, we're all connected, but there's still a lot of Koreans. So if you were to tell me to number all the Koreans, I would probably not be able to do that. But we're still, in a sense, together.
Okay. So, do you know any of the case of more Koreans? Because you also have friends in the US.
Yes.
She told me her boyfriend is living in the US, and he is also overseas Korean.
Yeah, he
Right.
would also technically be an overseas Korean in the United States
Mhm.
since he got his student visa and all of that. But based on what I heard from my boyfriend, it seems that he seems to be able to adapt well in the United States because there seems to be a large diversity,
Mhm.
at least in the college he's going to. Not only him, but there's a group of Koreans where they meet together and they do 술 games, like
No, like
alcohol.
drink games.
Yes, like drinking games. So I would say that he mostly pairs himself with all the other Koreans that are
Mhm.
going to the school rather than, I guess, like Americans, pure Americans. So in a sense, you're still a minority in the country, and I guess you're looking for your own community in a way, while living in a bigger community.
Mhm.
And I guess you could see this in other countries as well. Like, for example, there was this podcast called Koryoin, and Koryoin are basically ethnic Koreans of the former Soviet Union, and they're basically descendants from immigrants that went to Russia a long time ago. And in the podcast, they were talking about how they, as Koreans, feel very different to just Koreans in general. So they said a very interesting quote, which is looking similar but feeling different, in a sense that they look the same. You would probably look at me and think, oh, Korean, but in the inside, because you have been adapting to another culture for a long time that isn't Korean, you start to gain a cultural identity that doesn't fully form of just Korean background, like Korean culture, and more like outside, like external factors such as living in Russia. So I feel like that's something that a lot of overseas Koreans all over the world can kind of relate to. So yeah.
Yeah, like I really 공감가다. Like I really
Agree.
I agree with you, and I feel like we have been foreigners. You have been a foreigner when you were living in Mexico, even though you adapt yourself and you were raised in Mexico. But also in my case, as a foreigner, sometimes I really need to look for people from my country.
Yeah.
Sometimes you get homesick and you're craving something from some food from your country, or just you really want to speak your language. In my case, Spanish. And the Spanish from Chile is really special. So it's not the same like talking with someone from Colombia, because it's not the same background. There's different cultural aspects.
Right.
But it's always not easy at all. And host countries in general often view minorities as others
Yes.
than fully integrate them. And
Yeah.
in my country, in Chile, there is some Koreans, but they're not actually really integrated into society. I know the other, but I have never met them. There's like in the US, like a neighbor, like an area that is just based on Koreans markets.
I think in the US they also have something like that called
Korean
Town.
Yeah, and it's really common because I think, from my point of view, it's really interesting how in different places, different cultures, there's like Chinatown, Koreatown, Italy town. So they tend to gather and they look for people. They have pretty similar backgrounds. As you just said, you have met people from similar backgrounds as you, Koreans who were raised in Mexico and then they moved to other countries or they came back to Korea.
Right.
So that's such an important insight, and it really underscores the need for empathy in some cases. Specifically understanding multicultural societies. And in Korea, maybe we are moving to a multicultural society. So overall, what have we learned today? And like, I think I'm the one that learned the most. Even though we know each other, I feel like I learned a lot. I learned today that you have two nationalities.
Yes.
You have two passports.
Interesting, isn't
Yeah,
it?
the first time we talked, like, for me, I saw you as a Mexican the first
Yeah.
time when I met you, and then you told me a little bit more, and now I know that you're actually like both.
It's because actually, like, when I am Mexico, I have to say, oh, I'm a Korean, right?
Mhm.
Because I don't look Mexican.
Mhm.
But when I'm in Korea, because I don't act Korean, I have to say, oh, I'm from Mexico. So whenever I'm in a country, I have to decide whenever if I'm gonna be from Korea
Mhm.
or if I'm gonna be from Mexico. So
Yes.
choosing your identity.
So that's so interesting. Like, you need to read the room
Yeah.
and analyze whether if you are enough Korean to say it or
Yes,
you are
exactly.
enough Mexican to say it. Yes. Thank you so much once again for telling me a lot of information. Thank you for sharing your pictures that maybe people on YouTube watch today. And yeah, this is a really interesting topic that we can be talking for hours, but we need to finish this podcast.
Yes.
Anything you want to say before saying goodbye?
Thank you, Benjamin, for inviting me to this podcast, and thank you, our listeners, for joining us on this journey. I think everyone's journey is very, very different, so never compare yourself with other Koreans, I feel.
Yeah, really interesting. And not just for Koreans, maybe when you are a foreigner anywhere, try to look yourself first instead of comparing your experiences with others.
Yeah, because I feel like the Kyopo experience is always going to be so diverse, since overseas Koreans can be overseas from anywhere on the
Yes.
world. So
Over the seas, like literally
Mhm.
anywhere.
Yep.
So thank you, and see you in the next chapter. Next week, we haven't decided topic yet, but please 기대 많이 해주세요. Please expect a good
Bye-bye.
new chapter. Bye bye.
bye.